So we're going to start with the Chinese evolution back in the Qin dynasty from 221 to 206 BC. Really, the unification of the state in China happened about 1,000 years before it started with the Europeans. Uh, we can precede this period before 221 BC with centuries of warfare between competing dynasties, which led to about 12 small entities as we get closer to 221 BC, each declaring themselves independent kingdoms. Then the strongest wins out. And in fact, this may well bear a strong resemblance to what we saw in Europe as each one is fighting for supremacy. But then the strongest in terms of military function was the Qin dynasty, which comes to power from 221 to 206 BC. This is a neat period because you're talking about state-like functions. There was a currency. They standardized weights and measures. They provided for various public goods, including roads, canals. This is the period when they built the Great Wall, right? One of the seven natural wonders. Okay, it's not natural. One of the seven wonders that you can see from outer space. The picture that you see here are the terracotta warriors. There are about 8,000 of them, plus about 130 chariots, almost 700 horses, and they're buried around the site of Qin Shi Huang's mausoleum, so circa 240 BC, give or take, probably give. But this was actually on display I think it was the National Geographic Museum a few years back. Under the Han Dynasty, from 206 to 206 BC to 220 CE, you've got a period of growing international and local trade. So the Chinese were out and about. They were going out exploring when the Europeans were still trying to figure out, I don't know, how to cook a mammoth or something. This also led to the increased influence of Confucianism. And so Confucianism stresses hierarchy, meritocracy, obedience, the very traditional political, cultural values that we talked about early on in the class. And of course, this is the period when you had the evolution of this very strong civil service, including exams that were based on Confucianism, in part at least, to get into the civil service. Now, things were going well for a while, and then things started going bad under the Wei Dynasty, and you've got 4 years of division, 4 centuries of division. Only with 4 years. You've got these centuries of division, you've got a deterioration of the state, but by the time the Tang Dynasty comes into power in 591 AD, or CE, as the case may be, we're talking about the gradual resurrection of the bureaucracy. And remember, this is the period when China goes off into Japan, and so they bring this resurrected bureaucracy, which is, again, it is a meritocracy, and they bring this to Japan, which plants the seeds for the stuff that we talked about in the last class. They also create a new gentry class that would join and then become central to holding China together, and they foster economic development and innovation. And so this is the beginning of China's rise. By the 14th century, really until the 17th century, China is a world leader. It's a world leader in terms of science, in terms of economics. But then as Europe rises by the 17th century, China begins to stumble, and it stagnates and turns inwards. And at this point, just as you saw in the case of Japan, the bureaucracy begins to slide backwards. So we had this uneven movement of the civil service in Japan. The same thing happens in China, not surprisingly, perhaps. And it becomes a backward pulling force. Those within the civil service become suspicious of anything coming from the outside. They become increasingly interested more in maintaining privileges and personal enrichment than in progress per se. And so you couldn't see me, but I was making those little quotation marks, progress, when I said that. By the time the Portuguese come, and this is still early on, the Portuguese get there in 1514, but then as more and more European traders come in the 17th, 16th, and 17th and 18th centuries, they're trying to establish contacts, but there's really a lack of interest from China. So if you want to step back, well, I'd like you to step back and think about the evolutionary theory and what this tells us about China's rise and early decline. And again, think back on the Qin dynasty. You've got this period of internal competition. You've got this struggle, eat or be eaten system, and then the Qin come out on top. By the 15th century, China really lacks this internal competition. And so what you have to focus on is external competition. This leads actually to That's actually a good question. Why they didn't function better given this external competition? Maybe it was too far, too far away. Maybe there were certain characteristics of the bureaucracy, but what you got was a lack of innovation, and you got isolation. So it raises some questions about the competition model, which are important to think about. So now we're going from imperialism to communism, and I know if there are any historians among you, you're angry. But don't be angry, because I'm a political scientist. And what we're doing, again, is we're collecting data points. We're looking for little pieces that we can put together and look for some common trends. So the pictures that you see here, this is actually a political cartoon from the period, showing China being divided up by pretty much everyone, primarily the Europeans. The Japanese are in there as well. Then you've got pictures of the Civil War, 1947 Shanghai, chaos of the Civil War. So in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this was the period of imperialism. And wars led to the loss of Hong Kong to the UK. Other parts of China went to France and also Japan. So there was this carving up of China. You had a 1911 revolt, which led to a republic. And a republic is a state in which people have a say in governance. But soon you had fighting between regional warlords, and two main parties were vying for control. And these two main parties are the Nationalist Party, the KMT, which wanted rapid modernization and a break with traditional institutions, and then the Communist Party, which was established actually in 1921, so about 10 years after the revolt. And the Communist Party wanted, of course, communism, Marxism, and at this point, Leninism. That's really the model that they would end up following. In the late 1920s, the KMT ruled most of the state, but they were dictatorial and they were corrupt. And the communists had lots of sway, actually, and very oddly, in the rural areas. And in part, one reason for this, or one reason for how this strengthens, and you find this really odd situation where the Chinese communists are most powerful in the rural areas, is because of Mao's Long March. So the Civil War goes from 1927 up till just about 1950, and the KMT, the Nationalist Party, with the Chinese military against the People's Liberation Army of the Communist Party. Mao's Long March refers to Mao's armies marching. They faced repression, and they marched 6,000 miles between 1934 and 1935. Tens of thousands of people died during this march, but it's hard to say more important than the lives lost. Let me think about how to rephrase that. A more profound impact on China's evolution was the ideology that they spread as they marched this direction. And so, of course, they were spreading the communist ideology. So they were meeting with lots of people, and they were talking about, this corrupt and dictatorial regime that they were living under, and they were spreading the communist ideology. During the war with Japan, the KMT was weakened, and this enhanced the Chinese Communist Party's nationalist credentials. The PLA coordinated various attacks with the KMT on the Japanese, so they were given credit for actually cooperating with the government, but then they were still vying for local supremacy, and so you frequently had hostilities in between them. So they came together sometimes to fight a common enemy, but then they would go at it with each other. After World War II, all-out civil war resumed, and the KMT's urban base was no longer loyal. And again, this was as a result of this perception that the KMT was so thoroughly corrupt. And corruption is what brings down a lot of regimes. If you look at the most recent events in Egypt and Tunisia, really around a lot of the Arab world, and then before that in a lot of Eastern Europe with the 2000s, 2003, 2004, 2005 events in various parts of the post-communist world, what you find is that corruption is a lead culprit. It's not that people want freedom per se, but it's that they want a country free of corruption. And democracy is one of the mechanisms that's supposed to provide for transparency. So this is what you had happening after World War II during the Civil War. The KMT's urban base was drying up because people were unhappy with the corrupt regime. and at the same time, the communists were solidifying control of the countryside, which, as I mentioned before, in part thanks to Mao's Long March, they had already had stuck their tentacles in all over the place. So in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party enters the capital, and Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan. And by 1950, the Civil War is officially over, and the communists are firmly in power. So, first question at this point is, how should China relate to Marxism? Well, think about that. Where does Marxism fit in with China? That's right, very awkwardly, very poorly. They really lacked all the conditions that Marx talks about. We were talking essentially about a largely feudal sort of system at this point. Feudal. It was an agrarian state, okay, just like the Soviet Union was, or Russia was, I should say. It was an agrarian state, and so it's amazing. It would be amazing to Marx that they had any Chinese communist revolution. Of course, Marx wouldn't have called this a communist revolution. He wouldn't have called this communism. And so now we'll go and we'll talk about communism in a new slide.